This is part 2 of the video on marketing and crowdfunding, and this is the one where I go into great detail on what the crowdfunding experience has been like for me. This video was a little bit delayed, so for anybody who was waiting, I apologize for the wait. Professional life had to take priority for a bit, but we're here. This is a long one. It is 40 minutes long. I have broken it into chapters so you can skim through, and remember that this is not a series of bullet point tips. This is the best I can do is offer a narrative, because I don't have enough experience with this. I can tell you, do this, do that, it will work, it won't work. Instead, all I can do is share, this is what I think is working, this is how I've gone about it. And so it's not really advice as much as it is testimonial. This is how crowdfunding has worked for me. Glean from it whatever you will. And if you find you have questions, put them in the comments, and at least for the first few days, I will try to be very responsive with those, filling in any gaps that I didn't mention in the video. And be sure to do all the liking and subscribing and checking out my comic. A ton of stuff in the description below that you'll hear about in the video, a lot of links, so keep an eye on that as well. And here we go. So I'll admit that before I did my own Kickstarter, I had never really used Kickstarter. I didn't know that much about it. One thing I have heard is Kickstarter horror stories where people have failed to hold up their obligation at the end of the campaign. They end up with a lot of money and then they never actually deliver whatever it was they promised, and then people hate them and they've done something immoral, and I didn't want to do that. I was extremely worried about that. But unfortunately with Kickstarter, you're not necessarily going to have a lot of guarantees. You've got to roll the dice on a few things. You've got to roll the dice on whether or not you can get the money, but then also, if this is your first time doing it, on getting a quality print, being able to ship it out, being able to fulfill and get all those things out on time. There's a lot of guesswork to it. And so if you are trying to do it, not having certainty isn't a reason to abandon the idea. But it is a reason to be cautious and to be as honest as possible and as good with communication as possible, which is not necessarily one of my strengths. And so I worried about this quite a bit too, of being a good communicator, at least to the best of my ability. But Kickstarter, of course, requires you to know how much money you're going to ask for. And so I wanted to have the most realistic number of that I could, even with all these guesses in play. And so the first question that I had to answer for myself is, how do I get these books printed in good quality that I can trust? I wanted hardcover, and I wanted sewn binding. I do know enough about book binding to know that the best possible quality that you can get from a book is one that has a sewn binding. It is quite difficult to find a printer who will do the number that I need done, because I don't have the money to do a gigantic print run. I figured at best I was going to be going for about 1,000 books. And so whatever price I could get on 1,000 books from a printer in hardcover with sewn binding is what I was looking for. Now, I talked to another comic artist who had done a crowdfunding campaign before, years ago, and asked him how he got his books printed. And he suggested that I try Print Ninja. Print Ninja looks like a really good company, and the book that I had bought from this guy, which was actually my first and only Kickstarter purchase up to that time, and it had been years prior, it was a really good quality book. I was very happy with it. And so I looked into Print Ninja, and what I saw is that they, for one thing, had a great quote system, so you could get a quote pretty easily and see what your book would actually look like. But I did notice that they were printing in China. Essentially what Print Ninja does is they're kind of a domestic company that then prints in China, and they handle all the processing with the manufacturing stuff so that you don't have to do it. But of course that made me think, can I just go to a printer in China and get an even better price? And so I started Googling things like how to print books in China. that was the level of my expertise. And ultimately I found that yes, you can, in a pretty interesting and accessible way. It's not nearly as difficult as I assumed it would be. What I did was I made an account at Alibaba. And Alibaba is kind of an international manufacturing directory, and you can access people who make all kinds of things in there. You can get directly to manufacturers that otherwise would have been kind of inaccessible. Now, there's probably other places that do this as well. I have no idea if Alibaba is the only one, but it was really useful, and so I didn't find a need to go out and look for other things. And so I went on there and I created an account, And it gives you the ability to say that you're looking for something. It kind of like putting out a signal that you're looking for, in my case, a printer who could do books. And so not only was I browsing various businesses and looking at the kind of printing they do and trying to figure out, is this legitimate? Is it a scam? I had no idea about any of it. But I put on that setting, I can't remember exactly what it is, you'll probably run across it if you go in there, that says basically I'm available looking for someone to print. And then I started getting hundreds of messages from various printers, all of them giving me a pitch on price for something. In fact, it massively overwhelmed the inbox, and I do not recommend doing that at all. But Alibaba has some pretty useful features where you can look at an individual business and the kind of things they offer. You know, you go looking for a product and that leads you to a business. I was looking for having a hardcover book printed, and so that led me to a printer. And then they'll give you some information about it. They'll tell you where they are. They'll give you some photos from inside. They'll try to give you some confidence that this is a legitimate business that's doing business ethically and that you can trust. But at the same time, I had no idea if I could trust it, so I was scared to death. But I found a company called Ningbo-Maticus. That is how I assume it is pronounced. I do not know. And so I started doing a chat back and forth with the representative on there, and essentially you just talk back and forth with them about the project, and then they set it up for you. They give you templates so that you can get the pages in order, all those kinds of things, so that you can get the cover. You talk about the stock of paper, all that kind of stuff, and then get a pitch. And essentially what I found was that with this printer, I could get my hardcover book with a total page count of about 146. I put in the 129 comic pages and then a little more extra stuff to kind of add to the interest of the book. And all in all, I was only going to be paying about $5.50 per hardcover book after shipping. So after it gets shipped to the US, I was only going to be paying about $5.50. And that sounded pretty appealing for 1,000 books. So if I was going to get a print order of 1,000, it was going to end up being about $5,500. And if you end up doing something like that, you would also want to inquire as to whether or not that includes the duties to get it into the country, which can end up being a little bit of money. For that first print run, I ended up with an extra payment of $400 that I didn't expect. So with those kinds of things, you have to ask questions. I didn't know what questions to ask. I also, though, spent $100 having a sample made that they then shipped to me. And so I waited about 10, 12 days, something like that, for the sample to arrive after I gave them all the print files and everything to put the book together. And then I looked at it, and it was good condition. It was good quality. In fact, I still have the sample print here, and looks pretty good. The color was a little bit off. You always end up with a little bit of a color shift when you have something printed. And this was really useful to me to go through, and I just opened this book and went through my files, put curves layers over them or did color adjustments and just tweaked them based upon what I saw here. If it was too intense, I backed it off. If it wasn't intense enough, I bumped it up, because sometimes you lose some saturation in the printing. And so I was able to tweak it a little bit just based on how the print came out. And so that gave me a little bit of confidence of how it would come out, and I started putting together that Kickstarter in earnest. However, if you are having a book printed, it's a lot more than just the printing that you're paying for. I had to increase a little bit of budget for marketing. I had to make sure I had something in there that I could use to market the book. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I was going to throw something in there, and I didn't know what a good number was, so I just said $300 in marketing. And that's what I gave myself, completely arbitrarily. I also knew that I was going to have to do shipping, and I was going to have to do shipping supplies, so I was going to have some way to ship it out. And the way I ended up doing that was getting bubble envelopes and wrapping the books in a kind of a hard butcher paper, so that if it was dropped or something like that, the corner would sustain the damage, and it would hopefully not damage the book itself if it was dropped. That was on the cheaper side of things. It was watertight. That was important to me. It's still hard to know how successful that was. People don't really report back that, the corner was damaged or something like that. You don't really get that information. So in general, I hope it worked out okay, but I don't really know. And this is one of the problems with crowdfunding, is you never really know unless somebody tells you. I didn't have any complaints, and I guess that's the best I can do. Shipping is also one of those questions that's a little bit unique in crowdfunding. A lot of people will do like I did and just include the price of shipping in Kickstarter itself. And so people will go through and they'll choose which tier of pledge they want to do, and then they'll have the shipping added on at the time of their purchase. Some other crowdfunding sources have started using things like BackerKit, which will come back later and have you pay the shipping to your particular location. And you end up paying twice. Essentially, you end up paying for something, and then you never know how much the shipping is going to be until you get an email way further down the road that says, okay, now you've got to pay shipping for this. I really, really hate that. I know some people prefer that. You're definitely taking a risk on shipping if you don't do that, because you never know how shipping prices will change from one point until another, because there's usually a lot of time between the campaign and the fulfillment. It's usually going to be months that are between those two. And it's very easy to get burned on shipping. I got burned on shipping, especially internationally. I thought I had put the number really high. It turned out it still wasn't high enough. So every single time I've done international shipping, I have lost money on every single book that I've put out, which is wild. But it is true, because I was charging, for that first one, I was charging $25 per international shipping to somewhere like Europe, and almost all of them came back higher than that. Because between the time of the campaign and the shipping, the prices went up. However, I really don't like making people pay for something twice and not knowing how much it's going to be, so I would rather take that loss than to put that difficulty and that uncertainty on all of my customers. It's a matter of opinion. That's where I fall. And then, of course, you also have to account for the fact that Kickstarter takes 10%. They break it into two different fees of 5%, I think, to make it look lower, but it's 10%. Your 10% of what you get is going to Kickstarter. And so you have to be aware of that, and you have to work it into the calculator. They do have a little calculator on there that helps you figure it out, and that's useful, but essentially add 10%, and that's what they're going to get. So the first Kickstarter that I did was for $8,800. And I had no idea if I could get close to that. I didn't know if I would end up just failing completely. And I was extremely nervous about that. That seemed to me like a very particularly public humiliation. And Kickstarter campaigns, they don't really go away. They stay up there. Even if they failed, they just leave the page up. And it becomes like a permanent memorial to something that did not succeed. I didn't really want that. And I'm fortunate that I didn't, because the first one was pretty close. Okay, I have to interject a little bit because I'm editing this video, and I realized that at this moment I forgot to throw in something. I was talking about how afraid I was of what the outcome would be, and left it off making it sound as though that if a Kickstarter fails, the person who put that Kickstarter together is marked for life. That's really not the case. What I was doing here was overreacting to the fear. I was trying to give a sense of the things that you worry about, but if it actually happened, if a campaign fell apart, that is by no means the end of your ability to try it. I would have been very upset. I would have felt bad. I would have been embarrassed. And then later I would have tried again. Interjecting so that past me doesn't give the wrong impression here. Whenever you do something like this, inevitably you sit there and you fantasize about, what if this went viral? What if it got way more than I was expecting? And you entertain yourselves with those kinds of thoughts. However, now, after having done this, I tend to try and push myself to think in terms of small goals above. I don't want to just make $8,800. I want to make $10,000. I want to get above that line. And then when I did the later one, I move that up a little bit. I move up that goal. But the vast majority of these things do not go viral. The vast majority of these things do not find some kind of magnificent success. The vast majority of them are fortunate to accumulate the money that they do and to cross the finish line. And so adjusting our expectations when we do these kinds of projects is an important psychological hurdle that you have to cross. Now, Kickstarter requires that you create these different tiers of rewards, and I've seen such a massive range of these things, and I was really worried about a couple of things. One of them was lots of little expensive items So, people like to throw in things like stickers and keychains, etc. And I was just fearful that I wouldn't be able to accomplish those things. I didn't know what I actually could do. And so I tended away from anything that would offer that kind of concept unless I knew very well how that was going to be made and how much it was going to cost and how long it was going to take to arrive. Giving yourself a lot of different design work, illustration work to do on top of what you're already doing might not actually be worth it in most of those cases. So I tended to avoid those. I did this pretty standard tiers of, here's the digital, here's the book plus signed, here's the book plus signed plus a drawing. And that was probably my biggest error, is that I didn't anticipate how many people would be willing to pay for the highest tier that I had, which was called the demigod tier. And it was about $55. It promised a little sketch in ink of a god or goddess of the choice of the person who got it. And I'll admit, in hindsight, $55 was pretty low for that. I didn't think very many people would take it up, and I ended up having to draw at least 45 of those things. And that is a lot of work, even though I did get through it. The second time I did a Kickstarter, I raised that price. But in general, in order to figure out what my tiers would look like, I just looked at a lot of other campaigns. I just looked at what other people were offering. I looked at successful ones to see what they had done in the past. I looked at current ones to see what they were currently doing, to see what people would expect. And I just kind of based it on those things. I'll put a link in the description for the first campaign and the second campaign, so you can go through and look at the tiers and see what I offered. Now, I also know that I am not famous. And a lot of times, the people who are doing Kickstarters, they seem to have these massive followings with them already. They've got, 100,000 Twitter followers or something like that. And then they post that thing that says, new Kickstarter campaign funded in 28 seconds. I knew that I didn't have a following that was going to be able to accomplish this really hasty thing. And I also don't like to constantly bug the people that I know to spend money on things that I make. I actually tend to find it a little bit embarrassing whenever people I know actually read my work. It's something I've just had to get past. I would rather sell stuff to strangers. I wanted to make sure that the campaign page that I put up was well designed, and it did a good job of explaining what the book was about and who it was for and what you could expect. I wanted people to get that. So it needed a lot of visuals, and it also needed to feel really professional. And so I wanted to have a good intro video. Oh, I didn't see you there. But now that you've broken in, let me tell you about my graphic novel, Theseus. See, for thousands of years, Greek mythology has had the capacity to move the human heart. But I think that it also has the capacity to move the organ responsible for comedy, which is probably next to the liver, shaped like a pineapple. And I wanted to have a really nice looking campaign page. Again, you can go and hit the link at the bottom to look at that and to see how I put it together. But that was high on my priority list because I knew that people would be coming through Kickstarter, and hopefully this would catch their eye. The vast majority of campaigns do 30 days. Kickstarter does give you the chance to change that depending on what you're interested in. There's a temptation, I think, the first time you do it to add even more time. It'll even tell you on the website that the best success rate is for campaigns that use 30 days or less. So going above that, I think, is a bad idea for a couple of reasons that I'll get to in a minute. But honestly, at this point, I'd probably go lower. I would reduce it because there's this big drag time in the middle, and you can avoid that just by reducing the amount of time. The vast majority of pledges that you get are going to be the first 2 days and the last 2 days. That's going to be most of them, really. Mine was relatively steady throughout, but 30 days was still probably more than was necessary for it. Now, in order to launch a Kickstarter campaign, you have to design the entire thing, put it together, and then submit it for review. Kickstarter goes in and reviews it, and then they send you approval that, yes, this is ready to go. You do get the opportunity to modify it after that point, but in order to make sure that everything that I was saying on there was considered A-OK, good to go, I wanted to make sure it was entirely done before I did that. This did lead me to make a mistake, though. And this was because once you get approval and you actually schedule the thing, you put the schedule out there, it gives you a pre-launch page. And that pre-launch page, people can come around to it and they can sign up to be notified on the launch. And it'll tell you the number that you have there of how many people are signed up for it. And you can even set goals. You can share it on social media and get people ready so that they will get an email in their inbox once it's ready to go. That's actually really useful, and I didn't know about that. I didn't even know that Kickstarter did it. And as a result, I basically got the approval and then set it up to launch just a few days later because I was going to start it at the beginning of November in 2021. And so I didn't get the chance to accumulate a bunch of followers on that. That was a mistake. That's something I tried to correct for the second time. It's useful to do that because it helps to increase the number of people who pledge on that first day. And so if you can get 50 people, 100 people on there, that's fantastic. It's extremely helpful. So there's a really useful website that's called Kicktraq. You can use it to track your own campaign, and then you can also use it to look at other people's campaigns to see how much they make a day, to see what's normal. I didn't really know about that at the beginning, but I'm using it now to kind of go back and remember how this went. And in general, and so I launched the campaign on November the 8th, and it lasted 30 days all the way up into December the 8th. I assumed the first day would be a little bit bigger, but I was hoping there would be kind of this consistent growth. That's really not the way it works. What happens, and the one I have on the chart here is pretty typical, you tend to start relatively high, and then it drops down, and then it goes back up towards the end. A lot of people who go through looking at Kickstarter campaigns, if they're not sure whether or not they want it, and they realize there's a lot of time left to figure it out, then they'll just hit the little remind me button on Kickstarter and it sends them an email later. And that's one reason you tend to get a lot of dead time in the middle, is it's neither brand new nor is it on its way out. And so people have the luxury to just come across it and then decide to procrastinate the decision until later. I also did a stupid thing that I didn't know was stupid at the time. I launched it at midnight. I still have no idea what my thinking was for that, but I launched it at midnight. On November the 8th. And in general, you shouldn't do that. You should try and launch it during the day so that it can, get caught up in the algorithm. People can actually see it. It ended up working out okay, but that was a dumb decision because that means it also ends at midnight and people are just not on the internet as much at that time. That's just not a great time to be doing it. So in general, I probably hurt myself a little by doing that. The first day, though, I ended up making almost $1,000, and I was pretty ecstatic about that because the total number was $8,400. I made $1,000 on the first day. This is going to be a breeze. It's going to be extremely easy. I knew there would probably be a bit of a drop on the second day. So then on the second day, I ended up making about $529. That made sense to me because the first day, that's all the people all your friends, all your family, the audience that you have built up to this point. They're probably going to go in on the first day, and so you're going to end up with a higher number. However, after that, it does just kind of start to drop, and this is when the worry starts to set in. When you start to run the math every day and you're trying to figure out, okay, how much do I need to make every single day before I get to the end of it? Am I hitting that number? Watching a Kickstarter play out over the course of 30 days is probably one of the least pleasant things that I have ever done in my professional life. There is such a stress about whether or not you're going to make it across that finish line, unless, everything hits really early on, or if you have this huge amount of pledges at the very beginning. It is really genuinely stressful. There was quite a few times where I thought that I was going to fail entirely. And in fact, I made yet another mistake that I had never thought about before. And that's that I ran the campaign in November overlapping with Thanksgiving. You can even look here at the numbers and see that there's a pretty big reduction in the number of pledges and in the amount of money that's being pledged right around the Thanksgiving holiday in 2021. In fact, Thanksgiving itself was on the 26th and I made $64. And I was ridiculously stressed through that. You tend to do this thing where, I had the app on my phone, which I hate the phone anyway, but I would have that app and it would be the last thing that I checked at night and it would be the first thing that I checked in the morning, and you would just constantly worry about it. And so it is unpleasant. It weighs on your mind, and that's another reason why I think I tend to prefer shortening it a little bit so that the people who can get in there and make their pledges, but you don't necessarily need 30 days to do that. I didn't like it. There was a couple of points where I thought, okay, this is going to fail. And I didn't know that I was going to have a big bump at the end. I thought this is going to fail. It's just drying up. It's tapering off. It was difficult. Early on in the campaign, people will comment a lot as well. It is a good idea to try and respond well, and to be interactive and to be active on the campaign. All of that stuff is good because that helps with Kickstarter's algorithm. That helps it seem like this is a campaign that people are interested in if there's a lot of activity going on. And of course, everybody wants the coveted Project We Love label on there. And this also was a source of great distress for me because I had no idea how to get it. I had no idea if I would get it, and I had no idea if I did get it when it would show up. I have seen people get the Project We Love label while they're still in pre-launch. I posted mine. The first day went by, nothing. The second day went by, nothing. And then finally, it just randomly shows up. And what it does is it helps you get a little bit of a higher ranking on their listing so that when people are browsing through Kickstarter, they have an easier time finding you. But as far as giving counsel there, I have no idea how you get that label. That one remains a mystery to me. I'm extremely grateful that I did, but at the same time, I have no advice whatsoever, and I can't seem to find any dependable advice either as to what it is that makes them look at that and say, this is a good campaign. The biggest thing I could tell you is just to try and make it well explained and try to make it an attractive, appealing, and professional campaign page. Theme everything around, make it look like you put in a lot of work. That's probably the only advice I could give, and I don't even know to what extent that applies. So take that for what you will. One of the things that I learned about Kickstarter as I was trying to market this thing is 80% of the people who pledged were people that I did not know. They were complete strangers. And so that's good. These weren't names that I recognize from my comic side or people that I know in everyday life. These were mostly people who came across it on Kickstarter. That was the majority of the people who pledged for the campaign. So it is useful to have a good campaign page, and that Project We Love label does seem to matter a lot because it helps you in those rankings. But I also learned that people who do Kickstarter, people who pledge campaigns on Kickstarter, is kind of a subculture in of itself. And really what you're doing when you create a crowdfunding campaign is you're bringing in your audience, but then you're also putting it out there for the niche crowd of comic-loving crowdfunding people. It is an audience of that very particular type. The reason why I mention this is because it's not particularly useful to advertise your Kickstarter campaign in places where people don't know you. I'll give you an example. I went onto Facebook and I decided to use some of that $300 that I had for ads. So I bought ads on Facebook, I bought ads on Twitter, and I bought ads on Reddit. And I tried each of those to see if I could get people in there. And I tried to target those ads because it'll give you a back-end ability to choose your demographic of people who said they were interested in comics and people who said that they were interested in crowdfunding. And I tried to pinpoint it to those different groups. And the success that I had in doing that was almost zero. Very few people, when they click through from one of those ads, will actually take the time to set up a Kickstarter account and then to pledge something. It's really low. So you have a really low percentage of people who are going to click anyway. And then you also in there have a tiny percentage who is willing to go through the effort of creating a campaign. So in general, if it's not people who are already on a crowdfunding platform and using that platform, they're not a huge fan of going through the trouble and the difficulty of understanding it and signing up for it just to get what it is that you're offering. I couldn't find any way that it was useful. I don't think that's where I was getting any actual interest. I have no real evidence that I benefited at all from those ads. I generally consider them to be a waste of money. And I ended up accumulating a little over $10,000 from the campaign. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to mention about how a campaign wraps up that's probably worth knowing. One of them is that people will start abandoning their pledges that they made much earlier in the campaign. Once they realize that that time is going up, a lot of people will cancel their pledges. And that's probably one of the most disheartening things you can watch, is when that number rolls back down and suddenly you have less money than you had before. And in those last 48 hours or so, people cancel their pledges quite a bit. So for the second campaign, I was a little more psychologically prepared for that. For the first one, I didn't know if that number was just going to turn into a free fall and I was going to go back underneath the line or what. Also, once the campaign ends is when people's cards get charged. And so none of the money is actually real until the campaign ends. And they have about a 10-day period where they will charge people's cards, and if the charge doesn't go through, they'll give them a chance to fix it. But you will also lose money there as well. There's going to be a certain number of people who do not actually pay for anything, they do not actually receive anything, the card fails, and they just kind of drop off the face of the earth. With this first campaign, about $300 worth of pledges didn't actually go through. So when you look at that number of $10,585, that's not what I actually got. It was more like $10,250. And again, Kickstarter ends up taking about 10% of that, and so the number gets reduced down a little bit further, and I end up with a little over $9,000 as the final number. But of course, with that original goal of $8,400, I had calculated in a little bit of buffer space for money, and then also I had accounted for that 10% that goes to Kickstarter, so I still ended up with a couple of $1,000s in pure profit at the end of that campaign. That allowed me to invest in things like getting tables at bigger conferences, buying equipment, buying supplies, and it was certainly a lot better than the $60 that I made off the print run of the paperbacks. Now, Theseus Volume 1 was finished at the time. And so all I had to do was to add a bunch of names to a back page, because one of the things I promised in my tiers was including a thank you page that had the names of people who paid for certain tiers. So I had to send out surveys to everyone, and Kickstarter allows you to do this, which asks for things like the address and for, particular questions that you set up for each tier of reward, including how they wanted to be listed in the book. And so I got that information from people. I set a deadline, had them respond. I put all that together and I sent it off to the printer for them to do the printing process, which ended up taking about 3 to 4 weeks just to print the books. And then for the shipping process, which was going to take about 6 to 8 weeks to go from Shanghai to my front door. And it was during this period that I discovered a new kind of terror. It was the thought of, what if something happens to those books? What if the ship sinks? What if they get thrown overboard? What if they get so damaged I don't have enough of those 1,000 books to send out? Now, I had ordered about 1,000 books, and the Kickstarter campaign had pledges that were going to require me to send out about 275 books. So I was going to have a huge number of books left over that I could then sell at my leisure, and they were entirely paid for by the Kickstarter campaign. So that means that my $2,000 in profit was going to be overshadowed by me selling these books over time for $25 each, 100% profit. However, I do have nearly 300 people who are waiting for books to be shipped to them, and I have no idea if those books are going to come back in good quality. Yes, I got a sample printed, but there's still something in the back of your mind that says, what if that's the scam? What if they send you one decent book and then they run off with your money or something like that? You just have no way of knowing when you're dealing with a business online if that thing even exists, if the people you were talking to were real. It's the internet. You just have no idea. There could be some guy in the suburbs of Indiana who's pretending to be a company in China. I have no idea. So I worried about these kinds of things a lot. And over the course of these 6 to 8 weeks, I was still in touch with the printer, kind of talking back and forth with them as they were trying to keep me updated. And that was during a time when COVID restrictions had greatly reduced transportation speed, so I ended up waiting a little bit longer than I anticipated. But I still managed to get them all right around March of 2022, and the books came in, and I was extremely pleased to see them. Now, I did get some shrinkage there. You tend to lose some books that get damaged in the process, and so you can anticipate that you'll kind of lose anywhere between 1% and 5% of books, depending on the amount of damage. I think for that first one, I ended up with almost 3 to 5% of the books being damaged. So there's a certain amount that just aren't any good. The covers are so damaged, or something happened to the pallet that caused damage to some of the boxes, and you do lose a certain number of books that way. So that's a good thing to keep in mind if you ever have something shipped from overseas. I'm not going to go into great detail on fulfillment just because that would take forever to talk about how I shipped and things. Maybe that's something for another video. Instead, I'm just going to give a little bit of a rundown of the stuff that I fixed before I went into the second Kickstarter. So a few of the things that I did was I decided to trim down my social media presence because it was too much work to maintain all of them. So Webtoon had been extremely ineffective for getting people over to the Kickstarter. It was one of the things that I tried a lot, was trying to get people to go from the Webtoon to the Kickstarter, but I was not able to get really any traction at all. Again, Webtoon wants to keep the people on the platform. There's no outgoing links. So if I want the readers to get to it, they have to open a browser and they have to go to Kickstarter, or they've got to leave the app and go to a different app. It's probably not going to happen most of the time. So I kept Webtoon going for a bit, but eventually I decided it's not really worth the time and the effort, unfortunately. I just can't justify spending that kind of time on something that is not benefiting this fledgling business that I'm putting together. I closed Facebook. In fact, I finally deleted my personal Facebook account in the last week or so, and I just cleared all of that out. Not useful. Don't like Facebook. A lot of my students told me that mailing lists were making a comeback. So I put together a mailing list, and it was one of the questions that I asked on the campaign surveys that I sent on afterwards, is whether or not people wanted to provide their email so that they could get access to the next book when it launches. So I created a newsletter, and I started to focus in my efforts on social media a little bit more. I still have Instagram, even though I don't really use it very much. Mostly I try to use Twitter, which I'm pretty bad at. And then it was also recommended that I try YouTube. And so this is me on YouTube. I used some of the profit that I made to buy some equipment and things, as I mentioned before. I bought a t-shirt press because I thought that might be an interesting thing to sort of test out, and I ended up doing that for the second Kickstarter. Not particularly profitable, but interesting and kind of fun. I feel like if I spend some time with it, I can find a way to make it profitable, but it's pretty time consuming to use my wife's Cricut printer thing and then take out the vinyl and to put it on the shirt and then to use the press on it. It's just a lot of work. You got to pull out all this equipment and all that stuff, and I don't have a ton of space. So I opened a Wix website store, which is carthageproject.com, which is where I intend to sell graphic novels from. That does sell some, but it is pretty slow. It's a trickle most of the time. You tend to get, at best, a couple of these a week, but then there's also these dry spells where you'll go 3-4 weeks without getting hardly anything. So it's a nice way to get a little bit of extra funds, but it's not huge. And most of the profit that I make comes from going to comic conferences, which I don't go to a ton of them, but just going to the ones that are in my region, renting a table. Most of the time I make a decent profit off those. I can make, $800 to $1,000 to $1,500 over the course of a weekend, and then I'm just paying the expenses of a hotel room or food, gas, etc. But honestly, me and my wife, we leave our kids with grandparents, and then we go and spend a weekend together selling graphic novels once every few months. Frankly, I enjoy that just for spending time with her. And that's my sweet moment of this episode. So it's profitable, and I get to spend time with my wife. So by the time I swung around to the second Kickstarter in fall of 2022, I made quite a few adjustments. I made sure to have a pre-launch page. I wanted to make sure to get at least 50 followers on there before I did anything. I announced it using my email list, for which I had about 150 people on there. I kept them updated, and then I let them know as soon as it launched. I raised the prices on some of the tiers to better justify the amount of work that I was putting into those drawings. I raised the shipping for some things like international shipping, even though I still ended up losing money, which was remarkable. And for that second Kickstarter, I did way better. I ended up with an opening day that was huge because of the mailing list. I ended up making the goal that I had, which was $8,800, about halfway through as opposed to towards the end. And I ended up walking away with quite a bit more profit off of it, which I have used to invest in more things, such as a camera and a microphone. All of that came from work that I did with the Kickstarter. After I got all the fulfillment done, I then have the money left over that I can use to invest in the business and to look for future opportunities of how to get my comic in front of people and how to get people viewing my work. I know this is kind of a long and rambling video, but I hope some of the information in here is useful. It is a wonderful thing to be able to get people to purchase the stuff that you have worked hard on. It's a really good feeling to connect your work with people who genuinely are interested in it. I'm not really interested in obliging anyone to like my work. I want people to run across it who legitimately enjoy it, and I do try to craft it for an audience so they can enjoy it. This is not just a vanity project, it's something I want people to genuinely enjoy. So if you do have questions about anything in particular that I may have glossed over, let me know in the comments and I'll respond. Like, subscribe, share this video. Check out my comic. Either you can read it free online at theseuscomic.com, or you can buy hardcover copies from the volumes 1 and 2 that I have produced via Kickstarter. And hopefully I will see you in the next video.